Evelyn adjusted the strap of her worn leather bag as she stepped into the grocery store. It was her weekly ritual. Aisle by aisle, a quiet routine that filled her otherwise empty Sundays. At 54, her life had become a series of such routines. Days punctuated by work, evenings softened by books, and weekends filled with errands. She liked the predictability. It kept her loneliness manageable, tucked neatly into the corners of her mind. But as she turned the corner near the produce section, her mundane routine cracked open ever so slightly. He was standing there, head tilted as he inspected a row of apples. Evelyn noticed him first by his energy, a relaxed confidence in the way he moved, as if the world wasn't pressing on him quite as much as it did on her. He was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, with unruly dark hair and a sun-kissed face that spoke of carefree days spent outdoors. She wouldn't have thought twice about him if not for the way he turned just then, catching her eye with a smile. It wasn't the polite, fleeting kind exchange between strangers in public. It lingered, warm and genuine, as though they had known each other in another life. For a moment, Evelyn forgot herself, her hand pausing mid-reach for a bag of lemons. "Good choice," he said, nodding toward the fruit in her hand. His voice was light, teasing. "They look like the best ones today." Evelyn blinked, then laughed softly, startled by the sound of her own amusement. "I'll take your word for it," she replied, placing the lemons into her cart. He didn't walk away as most people would. Instead, he leaned casually against the display, his gaze steady but not intrusive. "Do you cook a lot?" The question was simple, unassuming, but Evelyn felt something stir inside her, a faint, flickering warmth that had been absent for far too long. "I try," she said, her voice steadier now. "Mostly for myself. It keeps things interesting." He grinned, and Evelyn noticed the faint dimple on his left cheek. "Well, if you're the one cooking, I'm sure it's better than interesting. I'm Leo, by the way." She hesitated, caught off guard by his easy charm, but there was something disarming about him. "Evelyn," she replied, offering a small smile in return. For the next few minutes, they exchanged pleasantries. Small talk about recipes, the unpredictability of ripening avocados, and their mutual disdain for the long lines at checkout. It wasn't much, just a few shared words with a stranger in a grocery store, but as Leo finally waved goodbye and moved toward another aisle, Evelyn felt the quiet hum of something she hadn't expected. It wasn't romantic, not yet. It was simply a spark, a disruption to the monotony of her carefully curated life. And as she walked toward the dairy section, a faint smile tugging at her lips, Evelyn realized she couldn't remember the last time someone had made her feel seen. For the first time in years, Sunday didn't feel like just another day. The following week, Evelyn returned to the same grocery store at the same time, a quiet hope she barely admitted to herself pulling her there. She told herself it was coincidence, that her shopping list dictated her timing, but she couldn't deny the flicker of anticipation as she rounded the aisles. And then, as if summoned by that secret hope, there he was. Leo was at the bakery counter this time, chatting with the clerk while inspecting a row of croissants. He spotted her almost immediately, his face lighting up with the same warm, easy smile that had lingered in her mind all week. "Evelyn," he said, as if her name belonged to him, his voice curling around it with familiarity. "Back for more culinary adventures?" She laughed softly, the sound catching her by surprise. "Something like that. And you? Stocking up on carbs?" He held up a croissant, feigning seriousness. A man's got to have his priorities. Their banter was effortless, as though they had known each other for years instead of mere minutes spread across two encounters. This time they lingered longer. He told her about his work as a landscape photographer, how he spent hours chasing the perfect light, and the strange comfort he found in the solitude of nature. She shared snippets of her own life, a career in library administration, her love for quiet evenings with a book, and the small garden she tended on her apartment balcony. There was something about Leo that made Evelyn forget her usual reservations. He asked questions that weren't surface level, and when she answered, he listened with an attentiveness that felt rare. She found herself smiling more, laughing at his light-hearted stories, and even sharing small, self-deprecating jokes about her own routines. When they eventually parted ways, Evelyn felt a peculiar sense of loss, as though something precious had been left behind in the produce aisle. But her phone buzzed moments later. A text from an unknown number. She frowned, then opened it. "Hope it's okay. Got your number from the cashier. She vouched for me. Let me know how those lemons turn out." "Leo." Evelyn laughed aloud, drawing curious glances from a nearby shopper. It was bold, cheeky even, but not unwelcome. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she typed a reply. "That's quite the way to make an impression. But I suppose I'll allow it, for the sake of culinary expertise." His response was immediate. "Great. Let me know if you ever need help taste testing." Over the next few weeks, their connection deepened. They started exchanging texts, first about recipes and grocery store finds, but soon their conversations grew more personal. Leo sent her photos from his shoots, landscapes painted in golden light, with captions that made her laugh or think. She shared snippets of her favorite books, stories she thought might resonate with him, and small anecdotes from her day. Sometimes they met at the store, their schedules aligning by chance, or perhaps by an unspoken mutual effort. Other times, they grabbed coffee nearby, their conversations spilling over into hours without notice. Evelyn found herself looking forward to those moments, the spark of joy they brought to her otherwise predictable life. Leo had a way of making her feel lighter, more vibrant, as though she had rediscovered a part of herself that had been dormant for years. And yet, she told herself, it was nothing more than friendship, a pleasant, unexpected connection that added color to her days. But late at night, when she reread their texts or lingered on a memory of his smile, Evelyn couldn't ignore the small voice in her heart whispering that it might be something more. It was a quiet evening when the realization hit Evelyn, unexpected and unbidden. She had just finished unpacking her groceries, lemons, a few vegetables, and a small loaf of artisan bread that Leo had once recommended. Her phone buzzed on the counter. "Thought of you today, found a recipe for lemon tart. I'll send it over if you're interested." "Leo." Evelyn smiled at the message, the kind that warmed her from the inside. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she typed back. "Always interested. You've got a knack for these things." The exchange was simple, as all their interactions had been, but tonight something shifted. As she placed her phone down and stared at the half-empty bottle of wine on her counter, she felt the weight of it. How much she looked forward to his messages, his voice, his presence. And then it struck her like a gust of cold wind. She cared for him, not in the way one cares for a new friend, but something deeper, something more vulnerable. The thought startled her, and for a moment, she gripped the edge of the counter as if grounding herself. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was 54 years old, set in her ways, content with the life she had built around her routines. Leo was young, vibrant, and full of a kind of energy she hadn't felt in years. Evelyn shook her head as if to banish the thought, but it persisted, refusing to be ignored. She thought of his smile, the easy way he leaned in when he talked to her, as though every word she said mattered. She thought of the way he made her laugh, made her feel visible in a world that often overlooked her. Was it so surprising? She wondered. Was it so wrong? But with the realization came a flood of fear. What would people think? What would he think if he knew? She could almost hear the whispers of judgment, the disapproving looks, the words people might say behind her back. And yet, beneath the fear, there was something undeniable, an ache she hadn't felt in years, a longing she thought had been left behind with her youth. It was terrifying and thrilling all at once. Evelyn poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the window, her thoughts racing. She had always considered herself practical, grounded, someone who didn't entertain fantasies. But this was no fantasy. It was real as the way her heart quickened whenever Leo called her name, or the way her day brightened at the sight of his messages. She closed her eyes, letting the truth settle over her. She had feelings for Leo, feelings she hadn't dared to name until now. For the first time in years, Evelyn allowed herself to feel it fully, the hope, the fear, the uncertainty. It was messy and overwhelming, but it was also alive, and as the night deepened, she couldn't help but wonder, what would she do with this newfound awareness? Evelyn spent the following days in a state of quiet turmoil, her emotions teetering between exhilaration and dread. Every interaction with Leo became charged, layered with an unspoken truth she was too afraid to confront. When they met for coffee that week, she found herself hyper-aware of every detail. The warmth of his hand as he passed her a sugar packet, The way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the easy charm in his voice as he recounted a recent trip to the mountains. "You would have loved it," he said, pulling out his phone to show her a photo of a sunlit forest. The light was perfect, like something out of a dream. Evelyn smiled, her gaze lingering on his profile as he spoke. She could see the passion in his expression, the way he came alive when talking about the things he loved. It was one of the many things that drew her to him, even as she tried to push those feelings aside. But her heart had other plans. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the weight of her emotions pressed down on her. She thought about the joy Leo had brought into her life, the laughter, the warmth, the way he made her feel like she mattered. It was as if he had awakened something in her, a part of herself she had long buried beneath years of practicality and loneliness. Yet, for every moment of joy, there was an equal measure of fear. "What am I doing?" she whispered into the darkness. She thought of the age gap, of what people would say if they knew. She thought of her own insecurities, the fine lines on her face, the years she had lived that separated her from Leo's world. Her mind replayed conversations with friends and colleagues who had once commented on similar situations, their words tinged with judgment. What could they possibly have in common? Someone had said about an older woman dating a younger man. "It's just a phase for him. He'll move on eventually." Those voices haunted her now, amplifying her doubts. And yet, when she thought of Leo, those doubts seemed to quiet, if only for a moment. He didn't treat her like someone who was too old or out of touch. He saw her, truly saw her, and it had been so long since anyone had looked at her that way. Evelyn sat up, running a hand through her hair. She knew she couldn't keep ignoring her feelings, but the thought of confessing them, of risking the friendship they had built, was terrifying. What if he didn't feel the same? What if her confession made things awkward, unraveling the connection that had become a lifeline in her otherwise solitary life? But the alternative, suppressing her feelings, pretending they didn't exist, felt equally unbearable. As the night stretched on, Evelyn realized she was at a crossroads. She could let fear dictate her choices, retreating into the safety of her routines. Or she could take a step into the unknown, risking everything for the chance at something extraordinary. The question was, did she have the courage to follow her heart? Evelyn couldn't stop thinking about the risk she knew she had to take. Every time she saw Leo's name light up on her phone or heard his laughter during their coffee meetups, the pull grew stronger. Her heart whispered what her mind refused to admit. This wasn't just a passing infatuation. But how could she bridge the gap between the friendship they shared and the feelings she kept hidden? Evelyn had never been one to gamble with her emotions. Yet here she was, contemplating a leap she hadn't dared in decades. The answer came on a rainy Saturday afternoon, the kind of day that begged for something warm and comforting. As she stood in her kitchen, glancing at the lemons Leo had teased her about weeks ago, an idea took root. "Why not?" she thought, gripping the edge of the counter for courage. Her fingers hesitated over her phone's keyboard before she typed, thinking of trying that lemon tart recipe you mentioned. "Would you like to come over and help me taste test?" Her heart pounded as she hit send. For a brief, agonizing moment, she considered retracting the message, but before she could act on the impulse, her phone buzzed. "I'd love to. What time?" Evelyn exhaled sharply, caught between relief and panic. This was real now. She had invited him into her space, into her world, and there was no turning back. She spent the next few hours preparing her small apartment, rearranging throw pillows, wiping down counters that were already spotless, and setting out her nicest plates. It felt ridiculous, like a teenager preparing for a first date, but she couldn't help herself. She wanted everything to be perfect. When the knock finally came, Evelyn's heart skipped. She smoothed her sweater, took a steadying breath and opened the door. Leo stood there, rain droplets clinging to his jacket, holding a small bouquet of daisies. "For the chef," he said with a grin, handing them to her. Evelyn felt a flush creep up her cheeks as she took the flowers, their simplicity and thoughtfulness tugging at something deep within her. "You didn't have to," she said softly. "I wanted to," he replied, stepping inside. The next hour passed in a blur of laughter and light-hearted banter as they worked side by side in the kitchen. Evelyn was acutely aware of how easily he fit into her space, his presence filling it with warmth and vitality. At one point, As they waited for the tart to bake, Leo leaned against the counter and looked at her. "You've got a knack for this, you know. Hosting, cooking, making people feel comfortable." Evelyn chuckled, her hands fiddling with a dish towel. "I suppose it comes with age." Leo tilted his head, his gaze thoughtful. "I think it's just you." The sincerity in his voice made her heart flutter. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. But before she could overthink it, the oven timer dinged, breaking the spell. As they sat at her small dining table, savoring the tart and sharing stories, Evelyn felt a shift in the air. There was something unspoken between them, something that had always been there but was now closer to the surface. When Leo reached across the table to wipe a smudge of powdered sugar from her cheek, his touch lingered for just a second too long. It was enough to send Evelyn's thoughts spiraling, her carefully guarded emotions threatening to spill over. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, her feelings weren't one-sided. The evening unfolded like something from a dream. Time seemed to bend and stretch, the world outside her small apartment vanishing as Evelyn and Leo shared stories, laughter, and the simple pleasure of each other's company. The lemon tart was perfect, bright and tangy, but it was the quiet moments between bites, the glances exchanged, that lingered the most. Evelyn couldn't quite explain it, but when Leo had smiled at her after their conversation about travel, his eyes filled with something deeper than friendship. It was as though the air around them shifted. She saw it, felt it, a kind of connection that was undeniable. "So," Leo said, leaning back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers, "have you ever thought about just dropping everything and going somewhere? Like really running away?" Evelyn paused, a forkful of tart suspended in the air. She considered the question, the idea of abandoning her comfortable routine for something unknown, something daring. It sounded like a fantasy. "I used to," she said softly, "when I was younger. But life, well, life keeps you tethered. Work, responsibility, time." She let out a breath, eyes downcast. "You know how it is." Leo nodded slowly, a flicker of something in his expression. Compassion, understanding, but also a hint of frustration. "Yeah, I do. But maybe you should still do it. One day. Even if it's just for a little while." Evelyn smiled, touched by his words. There was a wistfulness in his voice, something that made her wonder if he, too, had dreams that were still just beyond his grasp. And in that moment, it struck her again. How much he truly saw her, how much he understood her in ways no one else did. "Maybe I will," she murmured, meeting his gaze. His eyes were soft, but there was something else there too, something she couldn't quite name. The conversation drifted, but Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, something that couldn't easily be undone. The evening had taken on a different tone after that, an unspoken intimacy hanging in the air. As the night deepened, the city outside her window wrapped itself in the silence of late hours. They sat together, Leo on the couch and Evelyn in her armchair, the room filled with the low hum of music and the occasional clink of wine glasses. There was no rush to say anything more, no need to fill the space with words. At some point, Leo stood to leave. Evelyn felt a pang of reluctance. She didn't want the evening to end, didn't want the connection they had shared to dissolve as he stepped out into the night. She stood with him, walking him to the door. "You're welcome back any time," she said, her voice a little softer than usual. Leo smiled, his eyes warm. "I think I'd like that." He lingered for a moment, and Evelyn's heart raced. Then, almost as if instinctively, he stepped forward, brushing a light kiss to her cheek. It was brief, soft, a gesture that could have been entirely platonic. But to Evelyn, it felt like a spark, an electric current that ran through her veins. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, as the kiss sent a wave of warmth through her entire being. When he pulled away, his smile lingered, and Evelyn could barely keep herself steady. "Good night, Evelyn," he whispered. "Good night," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper as the door clicked shut behind him. For a long moment, she stood there, her hand resting on the doorknob, the sensation of his kiss still radiating on her skin. A new chapter had begun, one filled with uncertainty, excitement, and a deep longing she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. But for the first time in a long time, Evelyn wasn't afraid to embrace it. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes, and whispered to herself, "I think I'm falling for him." Evelyn sat at her kitchen table the next morning, a cup of tea cooling in her hands as a memory of last night replayed over and over in her mind. The soft pressure of Leo's kiss on her cheek had stayed with her, like an imprint she couldn't erase. She had spent the entire night turning it over in her thoughts, wondering if he had felt the same shift she did, if that kiss had been as significant for him as it was for her. She took another sip of her tea, staring out the window, lost in her own reflection. The sky was overcast, heavy with the promise of rain, but it mirrored her mood, a mixture of uncertainty and clarity. She had never expected this, never imagined, at her age, she would be caught up in something so alive, so raw. The thought of being with someone so much younger both thrilled and terrified her. What does it mean to love someone younger? Her mind churned with the usual doubts. She wasn't naive. She knew the world would have something to say about their age gap. People would talk, judge, whisper behind closed doors. That alone was enough to make her hesitate. She had always prided herself on living a quiet, unremarkable life, avoiding unnecessary drama. And yet, here she was, on the cusp of something she couldn't ignore, something that set her heart on fire despite the nagging voice in her head telling her it was foolish. She remembered the way Leo had looked at her last night. It was more than just admiration. It was as though he saw her in a way no one had for years, not as a woman who had aged, but as someone still full of life and possibility. His gaze had been unwavering, and in it, she saw a kind of appreciation she hadn't known she craved. And yet, she couldn't stop asking herself, is it possible to love someone who is so much younger? She thought of the women in her life, the older women she had admired. They had all settled into their roles, mothers, grandmothers, aunts, and their love lives had seemed distant, almost irrelevant. She had once thought of herself as part of that group, someone who had long passed the stage of passionate, uncertain love. But Leo had changed that. He had sparked something in her that she hadn't known was still there, something wild and untamed, something that felt like it had been buried for years. Is this my second chance? She wondered. Or just another fantasy to let go of? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing on the table. It was Leo. Good morning. His text read, I can't stop thinking about last night. I hope you're doing okay. Evelyn's heart skipped, the words making her smile in a way she hadn't in years. There it was, the same sincerity, the same warmth. He wasn't running away from what had happened. He was acknowledging it, just as she had been, but in a way that made it seem less like a question and more like a promise. She hesitated only for a moment before replying. I'm thinking about last night too, she typed, her fingers trembling slightly as she added, it was more than I expected. She hit send, the weight of the words already sinking in. As soon as she did, a rush of emotion swept over her, a mixture of fear, hope, and something else, something like courage. She wasn't sure what would happen next. But in that moment, she felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. The weight of the years behind her, the fears, the regrets, the silent years of isolation, seemed lighter now. She was willing to embrace whatever came next. The phone buzzed again. I'm glad to hear that, Leo's message read. I think we both feel it. The simple words, the honesty in them, made Evelyn's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. It was more than excitement. It was the rawness of being seen, of being wanted, not for her age, but for everything she was, everything she still had to offer. In the quiet of her kitchen, with the first rays of sunlight peeking through the window, Evelyn realized something profound. Love was never about age. It wasn't about fitting into society's neat boxes or worrying about what others might think. It was about connection, about the people who made you feel like you could be more than you thought possible. And in this moment, she realized that she wasn't too old for love. She was simply living it, raw, real, and beautiful in its own way. She took a deep breath and smiled, the tension in her shoulders finally easing. The road ahead might be uncertain, but she was no longer afraid of walking it. The days that followed were a gentle unfolding. Evelyn had not expected things to move quickly, but there was a quiet urgency to them, a desire to explore what had begun between her and Leo. He called her often, checking in, sometimes just to talk about their days, other times to share something small but meaningful, a book he thought she'd like, a memory that reminded him of their conversations. With every call, She felt herself drawn deeper into a world that felt new and thrilling, but also profoundly familiar, as though the connection they had was written in the quiet spaces of her past, waiting to be rediscovered. Evelyn stopped worrying about the judgment of others, stopped listening to the voice in her head that had once warned her to stay safe. She knew there would be obstacles, people would talk, and they would never quite understand, but none of that mattered now. What mattered was the joy Leo brought into her life. What mattered was how he made her feel, alive, desired, and most of all seen. The next time they were together, Leo took her hand in his as they walked through the park, the autumn leaves falling around them like gold. His touch was warm, reassuring, and Evelyn felt an overwhelming sense of peace. There was nothing to fear, nothing to hold back. This love, this feeling, was her own, and it was beautiful. As they reached the park bench, Leo looked at her with such tenderness that it made her heart flutter. He gently brushed a strand of hair from her face and smiled, that same quiet smile that made everything else disappear. In that moment, Evelyn knew this was love. Not the kind of love people talked about in stories, not the fairy tale kind that had never seemed like something for her, but something deeper. This was love that grew from honesty, from the courage to be vulnerable, to embrace the unknown and walk into it with open eyes and an open heart. In the stillness of the afternoon, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here, how she had spent years wrapped in the comfort of routine, avoiding the messy, unpredictable nature of life. But now, she realized that life was supposed to be messy. Love was supposed to be messy, and the joy that came from it was more than worth the risk. The way he looked at her now, the way he made her feel, it was all she had ever wanted, but had never allowed herself to truly believe could happen. She had spent so many years believing love was something that belonged to the past, something she could never feel again. But Leo had changed all that, and she knew, as she sat beside him on that bench, that love was timeless. It had no age, no limits. It simply was. "I'm glad we met," she said, her voice a soft murmur against the quiet hum of the park. "Me too," Leo replied, his eyes shining with the same sincerity he had shown her from the very beginning. In that moment, Evelyn realized something that filled her heart with an unexpected sense of peace. Love didn't belong to a particular time of life, nor did it follow a set pattern. It simply was, and it could come at any stage, in any form, when you least expected it. So, as she sat there with Leo, hand in hand, she made a silent promise to herself to embrace the beauty of what they had, to live without fear, and to always remember that love, no matter the age or circumstance, was worth pursuing. And with that, Evelyn let go of all her doubts, her fears, and her past. Because the future, with Leo by her side, was just beginning. And it was beautiful,